What's happening, people? Welcome to this week's episode of It's All Blakademik with your host, myself, Jordan Jarrett-Bryan. Now, if my jump hasn't blinded you by now, it will do in a few minutes' time. So stick with us and you'll get through it. This week's show, we're going to have some fun. We're going to have some fun on this week's show, a little bit lighthearted, not everyday serious on It's All Blakademik. We're going to have a discussion and debate around what was the most interesting era to have grown up in. What was the most interesting decade to have lived through in your kind of, I suppose, formative years. Before I introduce my panel for this week, do not forget to subscribe to our socials. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, and we're on Instagram. We're on here, obviously YouTube as well. So please give us a subscribe and you will get all of our weekly content. And of course, we're a podcast as well. So if pods are more your thing, go and find us on the Acast app. We're also on Spotify as well. Right, so this week's show, I'm joined by Nels, Marisa, and Nick. How are we doing, guys? We good?
Very well, thank you. All good, yeah.
Good. Right, so if you're good, I'm good. Right, let's get into it. So I wanted to have this discussion because it's a little bit fun, and I put it out to a few of my friends, and they kind of have differing opinions and answers.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, there's something in there. So I've always felt that the most interesting era in terms of individuals and moments to have grown up in would have been the 80s. I've always wished I was a youngster in the 80s. I was born in the 80s, but I didn't grow up in the 80s. And we'll go through varying degrees. And I want to get your answers as to what you think would have been the most interesting era. Mm-hmm. And the only criteria that I'm going to put on it, you can give me as you feel fit, is the most interesting and important moments and figures. So that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be good things. It can be things that were negative, but interesting and interesting times to have lived through with interesting people, albeit not necessarily positive ones. So let me kick off with you, Nick. If I was to ask you, what decade would you say, and we'll go through from the 50s to probably the noughties, what decade would you say would have been the most interesting era to have lived through?
Well, I would first of all just like to say I think the 80s definitely is an interesting era. I think I'm watching a show called Snowfall on FX in America, and it's about the mass cocaine scandal and all of that, and it's really interesting to watch that. But from a personal level, growing up and all of that and all the influence that I see now, I would say the 90s is an obvious choice. Everyone has that kind of resonation with the 90s and remembers it, I think, from a older millennial level. I just think that we had so many moments, the Los Angeles riots. And I see a lot of parallels in politics and wider culture today with stuff that happened in the 90s. Nipsey Hussle just died, Tupac, Biggie, the Source Awards, hip hop was at its biggest, its most prolific, its most aggressive in terms of the music being so passionate, but aggressive in terms of the actual cultural stuff happening outside of it. Angie Martinez still has that Tupac interview, which is so fundamentally sought after by so many people, and she'll release it in her own time. But I feel like a lot of things happen politically. The Clintons, for example, Destiny's Child, the rise of them into popular culture.
So I'm going to get you to quantify the 90s in just a minute. We'll go through why you feel the 90s. Let me just ask you guys as well, just briefly, first of all, Nell, start with you. Which decade for you do you think was the most interesting decade to have grown up in?
I think it doesn't really slot perfectly into a decade, but I think from that time, that post-war era from about 55 to the late 60s, right into perhaps into the 70s, so much happened. There was so much change that took place within that time frame. Of course, the Cultural Revolution, but also too, if I think of perhaps would have been the most inspiring place for me to be in my lifetime growing up, possibly been to have been a young boy in Accra in 1957 as Ghana gained its independence, the first black African nation that was subject to colonialism, also to really gain their independence. See Kwame Nkrumah speaking of, in terms that perhaps today would perhaps frown on, but on those days they're revolutionary, in which he's speaking of, hey, there's a new black man who can run his own affairs, who can do other things. And then from there, it snowballs to Nigeria, Sierra Leone, into the Caribbean, to across the border, across different things. And the wind of change that was blowing through societies.
So culturally, that was the kind of 10 to 15 years you think would have been the most interesting.
Politically and culturally, there's an argument there. Yeah, I think there probably would. There's so much change going on in the air, particularly for us as black people, that it would be hard to think of. There's so much opportunity to shape the future, to really make a mark on where we would be in 10, 15, 20, 25, 50 years, till this very day.
Okay, let me pause there for a second. Marisa, what decade for you do you think, in terms of individuals and moments, was the most interesting?
Now, for me, I kind of feel like it's a little bit earlier than the time that you're talking about.
You pick.
So I'm quite interested in the 40s.
Okay.
And I say that because, I mean, for example, thinking about the Windrush era, it was a time where I feel there was a very cultural, we had strong cultural senses of who we are and what we were about, and we were very hopeful in that period of time. And, you know, when I look at the imagery that comes from, for example, the 1948 Windrush, when people came, Caribbean people were coming to the UK, you had this sense of pride. You know, we were carrying ourselves a certain way. We came with this, we are a people and we know who we are and we know what we have to offer. And I feel like in a period of nostalgia, I like that. I like the innocence of that space and being in a place where the world is ahead of you and you have this whole new future to think about and there's nothing yet tainted. And I also like it for the fact that even though there was obviously the post-war era was sort of in that space, that as a woman, women were finding themselves in that era as well. Women were being recognised for their capabilities, for example, on the back end of the war and what they were helping to do. And it changed things. I mean, interestingly, divorces rocketed after the war because women suddenly realised that, actually, I don't know if I need this guy.
I can do it on my own, man.
I've got this handle. But it was a time when I feel like as a woman, we were finding ourselves. Plus, I'm really into fashion. So I like the fashion for that era. You know, it was all about, you know, the strong female silhouette. It was the heels. It was the firm. It was a classy era. And I like that aspect of it as well.
Okay, so let's go through some decades then, and we're going to try and come to some kind of consensus as a group. I probably won't. But so again, what I'm looking for is individuals, moments, politically, culturally, musically, sports, all those things which for me sum up what makes a great decade or a great year and then extend it from here. So let's go from the 50s. The only things from the 50s I've managed to kind of pick out, the three significant things from the 50s were the birth of rock and roll, migration, so many people, as you mentioned there, spilled into the 50s, moving to the UK, and the TV invented, which obviously was a massive moment, I suppose, in the world. Can anybody imagine what it would have been like to have grown up in the 50s when TV for the first time was invented?
I think it's been really exciting.
I think so too.
Definitely a moment because it kind of, this is what I'm saying, history always repeats itself. So in a way, it kind of reminds me of growing up with the first computer, and I've seen the evolution of the laptop to the iPad, even in this generation now. So for the TV, something on its standalone, no other technology really except for the radio standing with it. It must have been revolutionary. Absolutely, to see like the coronation, all these kind of events that happen in Britain on that screen, if you were fortunate enough to own one or have access to someone's room that had one, it must have been a phenomenon, a crazy phenomenon nationally and internationally.
I think there's power to putting faces to voices.
Yeah,
because
definitely.
as you say, prior to that point, it would have been radio, wireless. That's what everybody would have connected with. And, you know, we've all had that where you're familiar with somebody's voice and then you see that person and you go, I had no idea you look like that. Or I had no idea you were that sort of person.
The mannerisms, everything.
And I think that's the first time that people start to see themselves in other spaces and in other places.
I think you make a phenomenal point there. Just the other day, going back to perhaps I think it was some point in the 60s too. What you said about putting a face to TV, putting a face to a voice, and thinking of the impact television had, and also to the impact television had as a political tool for empowerment in liberation struggles, particularly for Black liberation struggles in North America in particular. I remember just the other day I was on Twitter, and somebody just put up a video, about a 20-second clip, and they said, "I bet you'd never heard Rosa Parks' voice before." And it just dawned on me, I'd never heard Rosa Parks speak. And I always thought Rosa Parks would be this. You see the picture of her, and I never even heard the radio, but and you think that she would be a softly spoken, quietly with a really high-pitched voice. She wasn't. She was. She spoke kind of like herself, with power and strength and determination in her voice or so, and she clearly knew what she wanted. And it just really gave a new perception of Rosa Parks to me altogether. So I just was, okay, that's interesting. It's that impact that television had. So
Also, just to pick up as well, political figures in especially American politics, the way they navigated that was the start of the TV debates, the national debates. Ronald Reagan, so that he was part of the success was the televised debates and all of that, the Clintons. So what started with the TV and mannerisms and stuff like that continue to now to these days as well. So there's so much lineage.
And it was then used as a tool to try and get in power. They used the power of television to be able to sell themselves.
The role of the media, the role of charisma, the role of who are you beyond the politics.
I mustn't forget about rock and roll too at the same time.
Go on,
The rise of rock and roll. I don't know. If we think of all of our greats today right now, we think of Stevie, we think of Michael Jackson, of course, we think of Prince, we think of Jay-Z, Nas, everybody else. But the person who was the father of all of them is still alive. That no one really thinks of Little Richard when we're thinking of the birth of, not just when you're thinking of the godfather of black music to some degree. You've really got to mention Little Richard, Wap Babadoo Bap, Wap Bamboo, Long Tall Sally, you name it. And it's just somebody who's still living, still very much with his capacity to this very day, living with dignity, a pioneer on many different levels. And also too, if you're thinking of the cultural appropriation, as far as actually heading back to 50,
started then.
It started then with Little Richard and a man called Pat Boone, who is also still alive today. Actually, a Fox News commentator whose job was literally the record labels they'll get Little Richard's song, Little Richard would perform it, whether it's Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, all these great records that we know today, and they'll give it to Pat Boone and say, can you re-record it? So white audiences would listen to it. So Little Richard would get a tiny bit of money, Pat Boone would get loads of money, and now Pat Boone's turned out as an old, bitter conservative.
And these are parallels.
Making his money on the back of black culture.
These are parallels that exist with Iggy Azalea to this day. So,
exactly.
Let's move it forward now, guys, to the 60s. So I've got a list here of the liberation of sex, drugs, rock and roll, the birth control pill, Fidel Castro, first James Bond movie, Marilyn Monroe dies, the feminist movement, the I Have a Dream speech, Kennedy assassinated, Ali turned Muslim, Mandela sentenced to prison, Civil Rights Act signed by Martin Luther King. The 60s. Go.
Now, I feel like that was the first era that I learned about historically in terms of who we are as a people. Like, I remember being totally devastated at school when I was waiting for the Black History year, and we got to it, and we got to the semester and everything, and it was like a lesson and a half. You know, there was slavery, then there wasn't. I was like, what? I'm waiting all this time to be told this. And so it made me do my own research, and my research at that time at 15 took me to the Malcolm X, the Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights Movement, this conversation about us rising up to argue about who we were and talk about coming together and to fight against the government and the various structures that were in place that were in some way binding our voices. I think when we recognised that there was all this appropriation that was going on, and all of a sudden we're going, hang on, we want to reclaim us and who we are and what we're about. So that for me was the era when I first started to say, well, this is what black is. And then I started to go backwards after that, but that was the first space for me. And then of course even though it's in the 90s, when we started to get movies like Malcolm X and those sorts of films that started to give imagery around that era, it made it feel like, it was good. On top of that, my parents were born in that decade as well. So I remember my mum talking about, my grandmother was the first woman on the street to have her TV and have a colour television.
And it was a big deal.
And it was big. And
you were bossy, you know what I mean?
That was the boassiness started. So yeah, I feel like that's the era where we really were about claiming blackness. And that for me was what resonates for me.
I've also got here Malcolm X was assassinated, the Watts riots. First Man on the Moon, Sidney Poitier, my mum tells me, was the biggest star in that decade. Black Panthers, the birth of them.
Do you know what? It's very interesting because I feel like for white people in this period, it was a kind of almost full-on liberation, like fun, careless. They didn't care what was going on. They could live, the sex, drugs, rock and roll, all of that. That was paradigm for them. But for us, it was a tale of two stories. So the stuff you highlighted just now, very positive stuff, empowerment, what you just said, we started to come together. We started to really, on a global scale, because the fact that we get taught American Black history in schools to this day in Britain is on a level. Obviously it highlights that America's hegemonic in some ways, but then it also highlights as well how as a world we came together on those colour TVs and watched our struggle live from across the world. And realize that, you know, wherever we are across the world, we have to come together, we have to empower each other, and we have to fundamentally realize who we are as peoples beyond the white structures, and to fight for our rights, to fight for all of this kind of political power, which through the Black Panthers, which did exist here too, created change and created stuff that still lingers on to this day.
Can you imagine, Nels, what it would have been like being a 16, 17, 18-year-old boy in the time when Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were doing their thing?
It would have been fascinating. It would have been a fascinating situation. I think
Like,
also too,
just to deep that for a second, like,
mad.
it'd have been mad.
I do think we romanticize these things a little bit.
Okay.
Sometimes, but why do we romanticize these things? Because it's kind of like, I saw, with Fela Kuti, for example, I saw a shift in him. For example, Fela Kuti has now become this person who's embraced by everybody.
Yeah.
Back in the 90s, when my dad liked him, my dad was pretty much one of these fronting upper middle class Nigerians who liked to pretend like he was the man of the people. So he always used to listen to Fela Kuti.
I love it.
In that regard or so. But then, it was actually a working class phenomenon. Yeah. The upper middle class is this smart. They just looked at him almost in a bit of a jokey way. He wasn't taken seriously. Now he's been embraced in retrospect in death. And the same thing with Martin and Malcolm, for example. They've become very popular in death. But in life, it wasn't as widely received as it was right now. There were actually people who actively worked against them. But if you just want to touch on the actual 60s in particular, I think perhaps the biggest thing that actually took place, I think started in 57, but the majority of African and Caribbean states received their essentially freedom, or at least nominal explicit freedom, on paper freedom or so, within that time frame. And one of the beautiful things that took place within that time frame is that they didn't view each other as almost in a balkanized or separate manner as we do a little bit today. That Martin Luther King was there when Ghana attained its independence in 1957. In fact, that was the first time he ever met Richard Nixon. In fact, there's actually a very funny story in which Richard Nixon was going around to every black person he could meet, trying to rub the Brits' face in it, saying that, how does it feel to be free? How does it feel to be free? And all the Ghanaians, Mr. Nixon, it feels very, very great. Thank you very much. And then he went to one particular man and said, how does it feel to be free? And the man responded in a deep Alabama drawl and said, I wouldn't know. I'm from Alabama, you see. So Richard Nixon was vice president of America at the time. So, but the key thing over there too is that, so the funny thing about that period in which all these nations were receiving their independence or so, and if you go back to read Malcolm X's autobiography where he spoke of his parents in UNIA meetings, United Negro meetings, I can't remember the actual acronym, but they would actually speak of Africa being free one day when he was a little boy, and then seeing it come to fruition and seeing them all come together. It was something really phenomenal, a dream that was born.
There's power in that.
It was power in it.
Let's move forward now to the 70s. A few notes I've got here. Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, abortion becoming legal in the States, the birth of punk, Arthur Ashe becoming the first African-American to win Wimbledon, Elvis found dead, Bowie even at his peak. Star Wars was born, platform shoes and flares, the freakish summer in the UK, Afro hairstyles, Muhammad Ali in his prime, Motown at its peak. You had stars like Marvin Gaye, Supremes and the Jackson 5s. Yeah. Would that be the decade that you would like to change your mind and choose the 70s maybe as a decade that would have been the most interesting to have lived through?
For the partying, maybe. But for the other stuff,
not so much.
Not so much. Like, I feel like actually in a weird way, the 70s is the decade I least resonate with.
Okay.
Now, I say that interestingly because I'm an 80s baby. That what I find is obviously within my, say, peer circle or dating in the past, I've dated men who were born in the 70s. I can't get with their music. Like, some of it was too much, and I can't get with some of the views. So for me, I feel like it was kind of a period of time where I feel like I'm glad I came a little bit later. Okay. You know, I appreciate the Motown. I appreciate that aspect of it. But I almost feel like maybe the freedoms that we started to express within the 60s kind of just went a little overboard in the 70s. Like, everyone was kind of losing their minds, you know, and I feel like it took us time to recalibrate some of that and to get that back into perspective. Yeah. So for me,
not so much.
No.
From a music perspective, that for me seems to be the first decade where black musicians and black artists really were getting their credits and getting their exposure. We were making black music and great music before the 70s.
Of course.
But this is the first decade where it was like, we're making stars, not just one or two. We're running the show now. Globally.
I think definitely you're right with like the formulas that came from the 70s and how they, the Motown, the formula that they kind of curated, the machine, how they created hits. And that still exists to this day. LaFace Records would not be here without Motown Records. LA Reid's Blueprint would not be here without what happened in the Motown. And I actually watched Motown this year in January with some of Dad's pod. And it was just so amazing to see it in action. Obviously you weren't there, but just to see how incredible that production was, you know, the prims, the proper, the hair, the makeup, you have to dress like, you have to dance like this, you have to tap dance, all this kind of stuff to get to the top of the charts. And you have to work 10 times as hard, but without the Motown era and some of the fundamentals, white people, black people, MJ, you know, Janet, all of these people here would not have got their blueprint, would not have got the stamps of approval, would not have got the how to be a star, how to do the media, how to work an international tour, how to come to Britain, how to come to Berlin, all these European countries, Asia. The Motown will always live on for that. Their blueprint beyond the music. They laid a foundation that record labels still use to this day. So it's so important.
Fashion was mentioned earlier on. Do you think that this was maybe a prolific decade for fashion? It was horrendous.
The 70s,
your face.
In the 70s, my dad moved to UK in the 70s.
Afro,
and he had the afro and everything else, and the flares, the afro was nice. The afro was actually probably not even the best. It was the only good thing. The flares and those funny boots they're wearing and everything, and the funny shoes with the high heels. It's like, nah.
I don't know where they were going with those high heels sort of thing.
I'm actually fine.
I'm good. Other than the afro. Even when you see the young, when you see Michael Jackson in his teens or so with his brothers, and they're dancing with the afro, and you see the clothes, like the afro is beautiful, but the clothes are just good gracious me.
And I feel like black men were their most confident with hairstyles back then. Like there's a confidence that doesn't resonate as much today. Like there's a barrier today.
I think it's coming back. I think you see more and more black men wear their hair natural and having locks and having their hair out. So I think it's slowly coming back round to this is my hair and I'm gonna have it as it's supposed to be.
I hope it resonates with like maybe not
so much other stuff. All right, so let's move past 70s, and that wasn't nobody's feeling that. The 80s now.
Yay!
Right, so this is my shout. So I've got the Thriller album from Michael Jackson, Prince, Madonna, Maradona in football, the birth of the internet, or it was kind of going before, but this one it really seemed to really make its mark. The 1980s Olympics in Russia boycotted. Charles and Diana getting married. That was watched by 700 million people. 700 million people watched that globally when they got married. The assassination of Reagan. MTV was born. The Falklands War. CDs were born. I've got here cocaine produced en masse. That seemed to be the decade when it seemed to be the real big thing and real big business. First mobile phone, Apple Mac, Mike Tyson becoming the youngest world champion. I've got Thatcher here becoming Prime Minister, although I believe it was 79.
It was 79.
Right,
it was the attempted assassination of Reagan.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And the fall of the Berlin Wall and Hillsborough.
Yep.
This, for me, feels like the most packed decade in terms of the last 50 years, anyway, 60 years.
Yeah.
Are you with me on the 80s?
Yeah, because I feel like it was a massive transitional space.
Yeah.
That gave birth to then the 90s, which still resonates, I think, very much today. And I mean, I'm with you because you missed one though, Diana Ross. Chain Reaction had
fair enough.
Fair enough. You know, but it was. I feel like it was a time of huge transition, and you're right. At this point, we have become established in so many spaces. We're established in the sports world. We're established in the music world. There is a voice given to us. I feel like, and that's why I'm so glad I was born in that decade, actually, because I feel like it's that space where you have enough nostalgia and knowledge to remember the past and where things were coming from, but you're also modern enough to be able to step into the future of where things were going. You know, and knowing that at the beginning of that decade, you had, you know, the half penny where, you know, we had, it's true, like old money and things that right now, they said that to people now, they're like, what? But by the end of it, you know, we were in that space where we were ready to be liberated and to be liberating. I think actually made it really powerful. And that for me, I'm so happy about the fact that we had things like the Olympics. We had key sports figures who we could look up to now, and that's when we started to see ourselves in different spaces, in different ways that, you know, started that space for expansion. So I'm with you. I'm so happy I'm an 80s baby.
Me too. Nell, so I'm a sports person. Sports is my thing. That seemed to me like there were 2 or 3 really key, I've mentioned there already, big sporting moments. So Mike Tyson, first of all, becoming the world champion, I believe at 19 years old, which is just weird to kind of think someone could achieve that so young. The Olympics in Russia that was boycotted, and we saw the fallout from that. That was where sports properly crossed over into politics and to culture as well. And also,
arguably 68 with the Black
True.
Panther.
Yeah, that's true. The second one, I'll give you that one. Yeah, and the third moment was the 1986 World Cup, where Maradona scored for me the greatest footballing goal ever, where he beat the whole England team twice, pretty much.
It's a big moment.
And then the hand of God goal. That, from a sports point of view, is that the decade that maybe had the biggest moments?
Carl Lewis, Daley Thompson. You think of Linford Christie. For me, was the 80s. I loved it. Just again, I don't know. At the time, I peaked at 9 in the 80s, but I'll be honest with you, at the time also, I was fascinated with the Union Jack. I didn't really know much about history or anything else, but I just loved, I don't know, Linford Christie in particular. For me, I don't know, seeing him, Ben Johnson, which we must not forget too in the 80s or so, which was like a really, really sharp moment. Again, you got this, and then that was the very Olympics, it was the Olympics, wasn't it? Which then Ben Johnson was disqualified, and then Linford Christie then got, was it the gold medal or silver? Did he move up to silver? I believe he moved up to,
I think he bumped it to silver.
They
changed.
The pride of seeing all those things. So from a sporting perspective, it was absolutely amazing. There was, I think, for the interest of balance, because hey, if this is what we have to do, there were some dark things that were.
Well, I was going to get to it wasn't all good.
It was the growth of the crack epidemic in America. So, but also too, when you think of things like the growth of the what we still have to grapple with today, the comic relief picture, the African child. Don't get me wrong, growth of famine, of course, to some degree, but then the perpetuation of the image of the African child as being, or the African as being woefully inept and in desperate need of charity in perpetuity or so. And that became normalized, and it had an impact, not just on Africans back home or so, but us over here, because as we all know, there's no separating black people. It's all pretty much failure is collective, or unfortunateness or failure is collectivized amongst us, and success is individualized. So that persistent portrayal of Africans in particular as being a place of absolute darkness became a major thing in the 80s, and it's something that we still grapple with till this very day.
Definitely.
Something else as well, the National Front, although I believe was born in the late 70s, really made its mark in the 80s, I believe, and you know, that was black people being chased down streets and beaten was a prominent thing that was happening during that decade as well. So it wasn't all good.
I feel like we started to become almost visible in a way that white people did not anticipate. Like, we had Michael Jackson, we had Prince, we had the Olympics, we had so many prolific figures, MTV, you know, MWA, exactly, hip hop being birthed almost around that time as well, or rising to prominence. And that was when the aggression really started and the social stuff started to come in. Really Project housing in the US, like, it started to become a big thing. The crack epidemic being associated with black people. It was a very important era in terms of how systemically the ways of the past evolved into suppressing black people into the ways that are still replicated today. So it changed.
You dismissed the 70s for fashion. The 80s worked much better. Let's have it right.
Big hair and shoulder pads. No, I disagree.
No, you're having it.
No, big hair and shoulder pads.
I didn't have to wear them, so to be fair,
whereas for us ladies, you know, big hair and shoulder pads, I'm still completely obsessed with big hair.
Okay.
Completely obsessed. Like, when I'm not braided, I'm like big mounted hair. So I actually feel like it was a period where, you know, fashion just got a little bit, it was all brighter. Everything was like sequins and shimmery and it was eye-catching. And what I actually like about that era, because I agree with you, probably wasn't the absolute best. It was better than the 70s. It wasn't the absolute best. But it was also a time where people were starting to become more individualized.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like in the 70s, it was kind of this whole, well, we're all wearing bell bottoms now. Whereas in the 80s, people started going in different directions with their fashion.
Trying a little ting, you know what I mean? Yeah.
You know, some of it worked, some of it didn't work as well. You know, and on top of that, how can we dismiss the Jericho? I mean, come on.
I was coming to the Jericho as well. I was coming to the Jericho.
Is that a good thing?
It was a thing. It was a moment. It was what not to do with your hair.
And what many of us were subjected to.
Just a question: did any of us have a curl here or so? Was anybody there with the activator or so?
Oh yes,
you had your curl.
I was subjected.
I must ask you one question.
Yes.
Did it drip?
Yes.
Your joke. Okay.
Did you ruin sofas?
I ruined all sorts of things.
Oh my God.
Seriously. And I'll tell you what made it worse was like I used to play a lot of sport, and I'll never forget the days when you were playing netball in the rain and the activator out of your hair was coming into your eyes and it would burn because you'd have to still shoot in the air.
Pain.
I remember the day I begged my mum to stop putting Jericho in my hair. I was like, I will do anything to stop that. Yeah, I grew that out as soon as I could.
There must be a Jericho billionaire somewhere right now who's still
living off that
profit. Still got it. Still got it. It's funny because we watched Nipsey Hussle's funeral. Rest in peace, Nipsey Hussle. But I did feel so. I wonder if we're going to see any Jerichos around here. You know, the old school OG blood or Crip who just hasn't let it go. Is there like
old Snoop?
Exactly.
And in terms of individuals, was this the decade as well that we seem to have big black individuals? I'm thinking again of people like Mike Tyson, megastar. Michael Jackson, megastar.
Like,
do you know what I mean? We had black individuals who were huge, massive in this decade
Prince
as well.
Even
Prince,
from
Prince,
UK
exactly.
perspective, even if you think of it from an activism level, so the growth of guys like Darkest How, for example, who became really, really big. Not Martin Luther King big, but as far as media is concerned, you wanted them on your platform, so you need to speak to, these are people you want to know what's going on. But yeah, I think that was the growth of the big black.
We had people we could see on TV.
We rose to a level.
Who were the biggest and best in the world.
Let's keep it 1 thou wow. Let's keep it 1,000. Let's 1
thou
wow, 1,000,
okay.
right? Michael Jackson was, remember in the 80s when you watch Michael Jackson TV and you see grown men just fainting in the front row. So with the children.
This is what I'm saying. The news, national news stopped for his video premiere.
Yeah.
That's mad. How is national?
And my mum talks a lot about, I believe it was the 80s, the first time the Thriller video.
Iconic.
That was something that a lot of black people, my mum tells me, was a real big moment because it was the first time a black iconic musician had his own video, and it was like 14 minutes long or something. And it was like a mini movie.
It was.
Do you know what I mean? It was a really big deal where she talks about the family literally around the table watching this.
Every year that is still played in some households. And I think you said in the 50s, obviously, the rock and roll era, that birthed incredible music. But this is where popular culture, like we inserted ourselves in popular culture, and there was no one on MJ's level at that point. There was no one challenging MJ, and he had his own stamp on history, and he was creating trends.
Not just as a musician, but as a mogul.
Yeah,
too. That Michael Jackson as a businessman.
Definitely. The whole Jacksons, that whole imprint was there.
Let's get to the 90s now. So I'll let you kick off as well. I'll interrupt you at the start of this as well. The 90s, fashion was changing and getting better.
Yes.
Britain seemed to be diversifying a little bit as well. This seems to be the first decade I remember where I remember seeing more and more people that looked like me out and about. We were the minority, but not the minority. You kind of get what I mean. Sitcoms as well. This seems to be the decade where we had lots of American and UK sitcoms everywhere. Every minute there was a 30-minute program on. The 90s. Pitch it.
Oh gosh. Okay. So as I said in the beginning, I think a lot of the parallels which we have to this day still exist because of the 90s and because of that foundation. I'm discrediting any other era. I think they all compounded to build what the 90s was. But I think Cardi B, she wouldn't be there without Lil' Kim. Nipsey Hussle, complete parallels to Tupac. There's so many pieces out about the comparisons between their life. Los Angeles riots, very prolific, and something that's to an extent been replicated through things like Black Lives Matter and some of the issues that they deal with as well. I think with like the rise of Destiny's Child, there were more people that reached that superstar level that Michael Jackson kind of created the blueprint for. Beyonce was then learning the industry and all of that kind of stuff, and what she's been able to do from the 90s. We were discussing earlier how Beyonce survived so many eras, and she got all her kind of stamps from that era and how to be a star, how to get all the accolades. The Source Awards, iconic for hip hop, that hip hop moment where the West Coast versus the East Coast, that's where hip hop really started to sprout its head from different areas just beyond New York. And I think, Angie Martinez, the birth of how radio became important and the radio personality and the hip hop personality. There started to become money in music as well.
I was going to say, in hip hop, that seems to be the era where the message was always there.
Yeah.
We had the message with a bit of style and money now. It was
we actually owned... Partly we actually owned hip hop a bit more than we do now back then. So it was an era of black, I hate to use this, but like black excellence in terms of like we were all living that luxury dream. If you made it, you actually made it financially as well. In most cases, we don't want to forget LaFace Records and Tony Braxton and all that, but we don't want to forget and TLC of course. But I think it was just an era where there were many of us in popular culture. There were many of us thriving. There were many of us winning. And I think the O.J. Simpson, so important as well. That good and bad, but we just owned a lot of spaces.
Indeed.
We owned a lot of spaces back then.
What are your thoughts on the 90s? What do you remember? Who are the figures that stand out across anything that really...
Cleopatra, I want to say as well for the UK as well. So important.
It's really not, but cool.
It is.
For young black.
Come on, for young black people. Come on.
There's nothing like it today. There's nothing like it. There's a tribute coming through.
She's doing a tribute.
You're right.
I feel like one of them for me, Mary J. Blige.
Yes.
As an example. Like that was when we learned all of her lyrics, felt her hardships through love and all of that, and learned about this kind of artistry that became born out of challenge and difficulty and things that we could resonate with. One thing I will say though, because I agree with everything you said about the 90s, and I do genuinely love that era and still to this day. But one thing I do think it did was the 90s damaged equality and our concept of masculinity and femininity. And I say that because I feel like a lot of women, we got mixed messages. On one hand, we were hearing the music of people like Mary J. Blige and singing along with that, basically saying, I'm waiting for my knight in shining armor. But conversely to that, well, I'm a 90s girl and I don't need a man and I don't need this, that and the other. And I feel like that dichotomy between us understanding what masculinity, femininity, independence, and all of the nuances between those things really became very blurred. And I feel like because women were starting to become financially more secure by themselves and starting to develop careers that were fulfilling, quote, men, that actually it made things probably more difficult when it came to understanding what true equality really means. And I say that because I think there's a massive difference between fairness and being treated equal. And I say that because I don't want to be treated as a man, as a woman, but I do want to have fair representation for my views and my skills as a woman. But I feel like those lines became blurred, and I feel like we're still in a space now where we're really trying to recapture what some of those definitions truly mean. And I actually think that's where that era became a little bit damaging.
But do you feel like the masculinity, femininity, all of that was defined before? Because I feel like in some instances they were in isolated, and they were in a space where it was kind of almost respectability, and it wasn't full breadth of that. So I feel like you're right, but then maybe unlocking all of those was what was needed to happen to then redefine and reclaim it.
Quite possibly. I just feel like it's taken a really long time.
Definitely,
I mean, we're still in that space right now where we're actually now having those conversations. And I think a big part of that was just where we were trying to get to this equal footing. But I think just people got the word equal wrong.
Yeah.
I always think equality doesn't really mean equality. And even when we think about it on a gender basis, on a race basis, it really doesn't mean that. We haven't gotten to that space.
Oh, definitely not.
So
yeah,
I just feel like as much as it did so many positive things for us as a people of colour and from a gender perspective, I also feel like it blurred lines that we haven't really fine jet.
I've just got to wrap up with, let's just very briefly go through the noughties. I've got here Craig David, 9/11, MJ died, the London bombings, Obama, and the economic collapse. Was that another packed decade of moments and big figures and big things happening?
I think so, yeah, definitely. I'll speak on this from a UK perspective. Because right now, when you think of popular culture and everything else, but music...
By default,
popular culture, as far as black music is concerned, UK, we're having a bit of a moment. We're doing quite well right now. And I want to take us back to if I think of the noughties or so, and I think of that one element or area within the UK that actually helped us get to where we are. There was a small channel called Channel U that really and truly I see that as the research and development unit for all UK music till this very day.
And it's funny, I'll let you finish, but at the time, I remember poo-pooing it. I remember being at college when Channel U kind of bust. And I remember thinking, it's this little two-bob man with his phone filming something. Man, what's some kind of idiot? You know what I mean? But you're right. Looking back now, it was very, very important.
It's not been properly documented as to how influential a channel that was. Because it gave there's moments in Hustle and Flow where they said what hip hop's really about is that from the blues to soul to everything else, it's everything coming into one place, and every man and woman has the right to contribute a verse. And I think that's what Channel U did. Before there's a YouTube, it granted everybody in the UK, didn't matter how good or how poor you were, the opportunity to contribute a verse, to do your little thing. And I loved it. Was woefully bad, but it was glorious to watch.
But there were gems on there too.
There was gems, because it was like, it's kind of, you're seeing so much stuff that was really, really bad, but it was so bad it was actually great to watch.
Yes,
and also too, when the gems come across with it, a Kalashnikov, a Skinny Man, you can argue in N-dubs. Of course, you can argue Pow, for example, which came out through that, where they had to go reshoot the video to go onto MTV Base and all those different things. So I think for me, when I think of the noughties, that period or so, I think where we're coming into our own, where we're finding ourselves as a society, particularly from a black British perspective, largely within that platform as far as culture is concerned, getting to where we are right now.
Grime, funky house. I want to say that's what I'm saying. It's a vehicle, Channel U, and because, like Jesse Bernard says, popular music journalist, he says that we have a problem with documenting. Channel U is so important in documenting that. What we remember, and even when it changed channel, aka, but still the foundation for that. Grime, what they had to face with the police. To this day, it still exists with the parallels with drill. I think, Black British, Kaching, CBBC, all of that. I think it was such an important era for us, and I think we will look back like Americans look back on hip hop, on grime, and we do. Grime, we just spoke about it on my podcast last week. Grime is like a luxury almost now, and drill is the kind of underground thing. It's graduated into that realm, and it's so important for what happened in past eras.
Just finally, the biggest political moment I can remember, because I remember where I was, and it's a really significant moment for me, was 9/11. I remember exactly where I was. I was with my friend Stephen. After college, he was bunking. It was in his house, and I remember he was playing some crazy game called Mur thing. He was playing it, and the TV next to him, it had Sky News on, and it was rolling live coverage of what was going on. And I remember that was probably the single biggest moment. Everyone has a moment in their lives, no matter how old you are, whether it's 60, 70, whatever. That for me is probably the single biggest moment I remember. How big a moment was that?
It was huge. I remember actually seeing that happen. I remember being in a kitchen. It was one of my earliest jobs. I was a really crap receptionist, and I remember saying to my colleague, it looks like that plane is going to fly into that building, and it happened. And what I know is that day changed my life, because I remember thinking on that day, there was the company I worked for, we had a site in there, and so we lost colleagues in that tragedy. I remember that day thinking, I will not live my life in a way that I have the ability to lose it doing something that I know is not what I'm about. I knew the world had changed. I knew my life had changed. And it was one of the most, it was the defining thing for me too, for that period of time. Nothing stands out more than that.
Let's wrap up, guys. You have a book. Tell us about your book briefly.
Yes, it's a book called Think Like a White Man. It's written by me and a guy called Dr. Boulay Whitelaw, who you would never ever meet, because it doesn't really exist. And it's a book about being black in the it's a book about being black in the corporate world. It's a satirical self-help book. Everything you could want to possibly know about being black in the corporate world is covered in here. Get your career on track and not your career or your wig pushed back. Thank you.
I love that, bars.
Exciting.
Listen, Nick, Nels and Marisa, thanks for joining me on this week's podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Don't forget to subscribe to us if you haven't already. We're on YouTube here. Subscribe, tell a friend, tell your mum, tell your dad, tell somebody. We're across all the socials as well, Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. We're a podcast on Acast and Spotify as well. Until next week, peace. So that concludes season 2 of It's All Blakademik. We're just packing up now from recording our final show of season 2, and they've been really, really good. I want to say a big thank you to all the people that have been working on the shows, all the production team, the editorial team, the social media team, everyone that's worked on it, the website that's coming up that should be out very, very soon, and all the guests. We've had some fantastic guests on the show. We've had some amazing debates on the show as well. I've really enjoyed it. The show is growing. We're already planning for season 3, and I'm really, really excited about all the new ideas, the new debates, the new guests, the new venues we're going to get for season 3. We're going to go up a level. One thing I would like all you guys to do is to follow us across all of our socials if you haven't already. We're on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. Subscribe to the channel, Blakademik TV. Tell a friend, tell your mum, tell your dad, tell the postman, tell the cabman, tell anyone about Blakademik TV. Get them involved and also join in on the conversation as well. Once again, a big thank you to my production, editorial and social media team. I can't do this by myself. I'm very proud of what we've achieved so far, but a big thank you to all you guys so far that have been watching, listening and subscribing as well. So please continue to do so, and we will see you in season 3. Big up.